First of all, I would like to pay my homage to the chief deity of this Mahavihara, Sakyamuni Buddha. And then I would like to, first of all, even if it is not my duty to welcome all the participants here, but really speaking, to be honest, I am today feeling very much ecstatic or very much exhilarated, to find you here, to have you here in this college, because I have been listening to the speeches and the lectures and the teachings of Professor Dr. Andrew Quintman, since maybe for a long time. I myself, I myself also having specializing or studying Milarepa's biography and his visit in Nepal and his meditation, his austerity, and Milarepa is a name, Milarepa is a name. Even if we recite, or even if we actually, recite or take the name of Milarepa, a kind of, uncontrollable or sincere or unbearable devotion, actually arises in our mind. Such is a dynamic personality of Tibet's great yogi Milarepa. So it is my privilege and honor to welcome you, sir, in this college. This college specializes in Mahayana Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism based on Sanskrit Buddhist literature, or you can say the Newar Buddhism. Newar Buddhism is actually synonymous with Sanskrit Buddhism, the only tradition surviving in Nepal today. And without spending much of the time, I have a lot of things to discuss with you, but there is a time constraint there. You also have a very limited time. But in spite of all your busy schedules, you have actually made your time, or you have uh, very compassionately, actually given your time to this college so that all the participants, all the scholars here gather in this lecture hall can listen to your lecture very jubilantly. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you very briefly to the public. From here, I would like to take your permission to speak in Nepali language so that they can understand you better in Nepali language. Because as far as English is concerned, everybody knows you. उहाँ हाम्रो आज एन्ड्रु क्विन्टम्यान सर यहाँ हुनुहुन्छ होइन, उहाँको नाम मात्रै काफी छ कि एकदम धुरन्धुर बौद्ध विद्वान हुनुहुन्छ। यसो हेर्दाखेरि उहाँ अहिले आएर हामी कहाँ आएर चाहिँ लेक्चर दिनुहुन्छ, साधारण व्यक्ति जस्तो हुनुहुन्छ होइन, तर त्यस्तो होइन। उहाँको तपाईँले चाहिँ नि गुगल गर्नुहोस् होइन, अथवा युट्युबमा चाहिँ खोज्नुहोस्, जहाँ पनि उहाँको चाहिँ लेक्चर स्पेसली मिलारेपा सम्बन्धी के त्यसमा मात्रै होइन, उहाँले अरू विषयमा पनि धेरै होइन उहाँले चाहिँ नि अब रिसर्च गर्नुभएको छ, उहाँले पढाउनु भएको छ होइन। तर म यहाँ उहाँको केही क्रिडेन्सियलहरू चाहिँ म यहाँ भन्न चाहन्छु। उहाँ उहाँ तिब्बत र हिमालयन स्टडिज होइन, उहाँ चाहिँ उहाँ स्कलर हुनुहुन्छ होइन, उहाँ स्कलर हुनुहुन्छ। अनि उहाँ एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर इन द डिपार्टमेन्ट अफ रिलिजन एन्ड द कलेज अफ इस्टर्न एसियन स्टडिज इन वेस्टल्यान्ड युनिभर्सिटी उहाँ चाहिँ उहाँ प्रोफेसर हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँले चाहिँ धेरै धेरै यो बुक्सहरू लेख्नु भएको छ। विशेष गरेर उहाँलाई चाहिँ नि चिन्ने होइन, उहाँलाई हामीले कुन बुकबाट चिन्ने भन्दाखेरि उहाँको यो बुक छ कि यो चाङलिङ हेरोकाको होइन लाइफ अफ मिलारेपा भन्ने। मैले जाने अनुसार, मैले बुझे अनुसार यो पाइनरिङ अनुवादक होइन, मिलारेपाको जीवनीको पाइनरिङ अनुवादक विशेष गरेर तिनजना छन् यहाँ होइन। तिनजना, अब एकजना इभान वेन्स भन्ने त अहिलेसम्म जीवित नै छन् कि छैनन् मलाई थाहा छैन है, उहाँ बितिसक्नुभयो कि मलाई थाहा भएन। अनि अर्को इङ्ग्लिस बायोग्राफी यो लोप्साङ लालुङपा भन्ने छ होइन, उहाँको पनि एकदम राम्रै बायोग्राफी हो मिलारेपाको जीवनी। अब चाङलिङ हेरुका भन्ने त्यो 14औं शताब्दी 15औं शताब्दीको आचार्य के अरे सिद्ध, तिब्बतको चाहिँ एउटा सिद्ध होइन, तिब्बतको एउटा सिद्ध मिलारेपाकै परम्पराबाट चाहिँ आएका एउटा सिद्ध 14औं शताब्दीको सिद्ध चाङलिङ हेरुकाले मिलारेपाको चाहिँ अब जीवनीलाई उहाँले विभिन्न अब उहाँ हाम्रो पुण्य सरको अनुसार त 75वटा होइन 75वटा उहाँको विभिन्न एपिसोडहरू बायोग्राफिकल डिटेल्सहरू कम्पाइल गरेर उहाँले एउटा जीवनी नै तयार गर्नुभएको थियो कि चाङलिङ हेरुकाले होइन। अनि चाङलिङ हेरुकाले जीवनी तयार भएको त्यो तयार गर्नुभएको जीवनीलाई चाहिँ नि मिलारेपे नामथार भनिन्थ्यो कि मिलारेपे नामथार भनिन्छ। अनि सौभाग्यवश त्यो जीवनी छ नि मिलारेपे नामथार चाहिँ नि मैले मेरो बुवासँगै मिलेर अनुवाद गरेको थिएँ कि पहिला धेरै पहिला भनेपछि आजभन्दा 15-16 वर्षै अगाडि होला है। त्यो चाहिँ नि कर्पोरेट बडीबाट छापियो त्यो चाहिँ नि तपाईँहरूको हातमा होला सायद सबैसँग त्यो एकदमै पपुलर भएको थियो कि त्यो। तर अब मैले भनिहालेँ तिनजना मेरो आफ्नो धारणामा है मेरो आफ्नो बिलिफमा तिनजना त्यस्तो एकदमै स्वनाम धन्य होइन मूर्धन्य व्यक्तिहरू मध्ये उहाँ एकजना हुनुहुन्छ एन्ड्रु क्विन्टम्यान मिलारेपाको चाहिँ नि यो बायोग्राफी एक्सपर्ट होइन एक्सपर्ट मध्ये एउटा मैले नामै दिउँ एउटा इभान वेन्जले चाहिँ नि यो टिबेट्स ग्रेट योगी मिलारेपा भनेर अनुवाद गर्नुभएको छ यो टिबेटन भाषाबाट अनि इङ्ग्लिसमा। त्यो अलिकति यो अब यो पुरानो इङ्ग्लिस टाइपको कि अहिले बाइबलको चाहिँ नि अलिकति त्यो फ्लेभर छ त्यसमा होइन। अनि त्यस्तै अर्को अब उहाँको अलिकति एकदम अलि त्यो भाषा चाहिँ क्लिष्ट भएको हुनाले पछि अर्को एकजना यो टिबेटन स्कलर होला सायद है लोप्साङ लालुङपा भन्नेले अर्को बायोग्राफी चाहिँ उहाँले निकाल्नुभयो लाइफ अफ मिलारेपा भनेर। अनि अर्को यो 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 चाहिँ बायोग्राफी छ यहाँ चाङलिङ हेरुका द लाइफ अफ मिलारेपा। यो तीनवटा बायोग्राफी यति यो बेस्ट सेलर हो होइन यति यो पपुलर छन् कि मिलारेपालाई जान्ने मिलारेपाको चाहिँ जीवनी चाहिँ हामीले चाहिँ अब बुझ्ने मेन लिटरेरी सोर्स भनेको यो तीनवटा बायोग्राफी हो किनकि टिबेटन त सबैलाई आउँदैन नि होइन। त्यही भएर यो तीनवटा बायोग्राफी मार्फत नै हामीले मिलारेपालाई चाहिँ जान्न सक्छौँ। यो उहाँले चाहिँ यो मिलारेपा सम्बन्धी यसरी उहाँले एकदमै डुबेर होइन स्टडी गर्नुभएको छ। त्यही भएर मैले उहाँलाई चाहिँ मिलारेपा स्पेसलिस्ट नै भन्न रुचाउँछु कि होइन। अनि उहाँले अर्को किताब पनि लेख्नु भएको छ उहाँले द योगिन एन्ड द म्याडम्यान भनेर के योगिन एन्ड द म्याडम्यान भनेपछि तिब्बतमा चाहिँ नि अब मिलारेपा भनेपछि चाहिँ नि अब श्रद्धाले चाहिँ शिर नझुकाउने कोही पनि छैन कि मिलारेपा यो कुनै पनि ट्रेडिसनमा चाहिँ नि उहाँ बाँधिनु भएको छैन। सबै ट्रेडिसनमा चाहे त्यो गेलुग हो काली हो निमा हो साक्या होस् सबैले उत्तिकै श्रद्धाका साथ भक्तिका साथ चाहिँ पुज्नुहुन्छ। मिलारेपाको नाम मात्रै लिने बित्तिकै मान्छेको आँखाबाट बलिन्द्र आँसु नै झर्छ कि त्यति किसिमको चाहिँ उहाँहरूको मिलारेपाप्रति डिभोसन छ होइन। त्यो त्यही मिलारेपा सम्बन्धी उहाँले चाहिँ त्यो रिसर्च गर्नुभएको भएर मैले पहिलेदेखि नै उहाँलाई फलो गरिरहेको थिएँ होइन। अनि उहाँलाई अब एकचोटि त्यस्तै सपना हुन्छ नि सबैको होइन एकचोटि उहाँलाई पर्सनली नै भेट्न पाए कति राम्रो हुन्थ्यो भन्ने मेरो विचार थियो कि पहिलेदेखि मेरो एउटा सपना हो। त्यही भएर आज उहाँलाई चाहिँ मैले भेटेँ होइन तपाईँहरूले पनि भेट्नुभयो एउटा यो सपना चाहिँ साकार भएको हो कि एक किसिमले भन्यो भने। अनि उहाँको अब धेरै टाइम चाहिँ नि हामीसँग छैन है अब उहाँलाई चाहिँ पछि हामीले भेट्दै गरौँला। उहाँको युट्युब पनि हेर्नुहोस् तपाईँहरूले होइन अहिले इन्टरनेटमा सर्च गर्नुभयो भने उहाँको चाहिँ एकदम छापछाप्ती धेरै नै आर्टिकलहरू होइन किताबहरू चाहिँ तपाईँले चाहिँ पढ्न सक्नुहुन्छ। त्यो हाम्रो कलेजमा उहाँ आएर चाहिँ यसरी लेक्चर दिनु भनेको हाम्रो लागि एउटा ठुलो अहोभाग्य हो कि कहाँबाट यो उहाँले चाहिँ यो पुण्य सरले चाहिँ गर्दाखेरि मैले अब अस्ति उहाँले चाहिँ फोन गर्नुभयो कि ल अहिले उहाँ एन्ड्रु क्विन्टम्यान सर चाहिँ यहाँ नेपालमा आउनु भएको छ है तपाईँहरूले अब मौकाको फाइदा उठाउनुहोस् न त उहाँ तुरन्तै जानुहुन्छ अनि पछि चाहिँ अब कहिले फेर्ने होइन भनेर मैले भन्ने बित्तिकै म्यामलाई फोन गरेर अनि त्यो 2 दिनमा मिलाएको यो लेक्चर। त्यही भएर हामीले यो आज एकदमै उहाँको चाहिँ ठुलो हाम्रो यो अवसर जोडेको छ महत्त्वपूर्ण दिन हो। तपाईँहरूले एकदम एटेन्टिभली ध्यान दिएर सुन्नुहोस् होइन। अनि उहाँसँग चाहिँ नि तपाईँहरूले कम्युनिकेट गर्ने कोसिस गर्नुहोस् कन्ट्याक्ट गर्ने कोसिस गर्नुहोस् कि उहाँ त्यस्तो ठुल्ठुलो एकदम संसारकै धुरन्धर महाविद्वानहरू होइन यति हतपति चाहिँ यहाँ आएर यसले लेक्चर चाहिँ दिनुहुन्न कि यो हाम्रो लागि ठुलो चान्स हो यो। एन्ड आई वुड लाइक टु स्पिक अ फ्यु वर्ड्स इन इङ्ग्लिस अल्सो बिकज I listened to Milarepa's biography when I was a child, maybe of 8 or 9 years old. My father used to tell the story of Milarepa, especially during Dasai time, when there was no work at all. So every night I listened to the biography of Milarepa from my father. And my father could teach the story of Milarepa in such a way that every time when we listen to the biography of Milarepa, episode of Milarepa, and everything that Milarepa underwent, during his search for enlightenment and during his earlier age, after he came into contact with his guru, Marpa Lochawa, and he actually got the teachings from Martin, and he actually went into a austere retreat, or very difficult retreat in the further mountains, and ultimately, due to the blessing of, or due to the teaching of his Guru Marpa, he attained uh, enlightenment of a Buddha in a single lifetime by following the Vajrayana teachings imparted by Marpa. So when we listen to the biography of Milarepa, especially myself with my family, because we must, at the time my father used to tell me we must make use of our precious human body, so we must listen to the teachings and the biography of the great Siddhas of the past, so that we may have some kind of predispositions in our mind, so that we will also attain enlightenment in the future time, if not possible in this time. So I listened to the biography of Milarepa, and every time when I listened to the biography of Milarepa, I was burst into tears. Such a natural and spontaneous devotion, arise in me, including my family. And later I decided to make this life story available to the public, so that they also can actually give rise to devotion or something like that. So due to the blessing of my root guru and Milarepa himself, so that dream came true. So in that way, I'm also now on the boards of releasing my another book on Milarepa's Doha. That's a song of realization. So in the near future, that book also is going to be released, and that the first part of Mila Gurgum. So with that, I would not like to talk further. I would like to begin the presentation, very excellent and very rare presentation. And so I'm going to hand this mic over to the sir.
Thank you. So I'm going to try, it's a small room. If I speak like this, can you hear me? Okay? Okay. So maybe we'll leave this. Okay. So my daughter is studying theater now, and she's taught me to project my voice. So I learned something from her. So thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. It is such an honor and pleasure to be here in Sugata Buddhist University, Buddhist College. So first of all, I would like to extend my thanks to the chairman, directors, the professors, students, and of course all of my friends here. Thank you for coming to listen to this talk. I should start by saying I'm also a little bit embarrassed to be speaking to you while I myself consider myself to be a guest in your country. It's a place I have a deep love for. And yet I'm not able to speak to you in your own language, so I feel very humbled that I must speak to you in English. I hope next time I come to speak to you, I can lecture in Nepali. That's my aspiration. I'm also very thankful to be here because it connects to my own history of spending time in Nepal. I was very fortunate to come for the first time to Kathmandu nearly 35 years ago. And at that time, I was a student in college, and I came on a program to study Himalayan culture and history and Buddhism. And my teacher at that time was someone many of you may be familiar with. His name was Hubert de Clear. And he directed a program called SIT, School for International Training. And at that time, during my studies, my thesis for that program was about the history of Milarepa in Nepal. So was researching some of the places that Milarepa visited when he came to Nepal. I was very, very fortunate some years later to come back to Nepal, that time as a co-director of the program together with Hubert de Clear. And Hubert himself also had a long interest and a love for the story of Milarepa, his life, and the places of Milarepa, felt great devotion towards him. And I also know that Hubert and Milan Shakyaji's father, Minbadur Shakya, had very close relationship, and they deeply valued the idea of communication between scholars to develop interest in different traditions, and had a very long and fruitful career of communication. And it's in the spirit of that model, and it's really in keeping the work of Minbardur Shakya and Hubert de Clear in mind, that I would like to dedicate this lecture and speak to you all. So I have a few things that I'd like to talk to you about today in the life of Milarepa. I should start by saying I've spent so long researching about the life story and the songs of Milarepa, the places of Milarepa in Tibet and Nepal, almost 35 years, that I no longer know what to say about him. But I'd like to talk briefly about a few different things. So first, I'd like to talk about the main figures of the story. So one is Milarepa himself, and the other is the famous author that Milanji introduced you to. His name is Tsongyun Haruka. And I refer to them as the Yogin Milarepa and the madman Tsongyun Haruka. Madman because he presented himself as a kind of mad saint, as a kind of crazy wisdom. And I'll say more about that. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the early history of the life of Milarepa. And I'll show you some examples of early texts that tell different stories about Milarepa's life. And finally, I'd like to take one small example of how to very carefully and closely read the life story that might teach us something new about the story that might not be so obvious. Okay, so before I do that, I want to say one final thing. I'm a professor in university in America. My department is not Buddhist studies. My department is religious studies. So we teach students about how to think about, how to develop questions about religions around the world and how they influence people's approach to life, to society, to creating institutions, to understanding history. And I would like to at the very beginning, to make one suggestion to you all. And that suggestion is that it's possible to read religious texts like the life of Milarepa, feeling, on the one hand, feeling great devotion, to feel great warmth and affection for the story and those figures, to read it as a Buddhist, as I do myself, on the one hand. But on the other hand, to also ask difficult questions about the individuals and about the stories. We can ask difficult questions about where those stories came from, about how they changed over time, about why they're presented in the way that they do. That is, to think about those stories critically, to think about the relationship of religion and history, religion and politics, religion and society. And to ask those difficult questions does not damage or harm our sense of devotion and our sense of closeness to the tradition, but from my experience actually increases our sense of devotion. That we can take the path of practitioner and the path of scholar, and they really go side by side, hand in hand. So sometimes I've published some things about Milarepa, about his life story. Some practitioners didn't like so much because they contradict what the stories tell us. But actually that is the job of the scholar, is to understand history and to present the truth of history alongside the truth of religion, and to see them both as important and how they influence each other. So let me start by saying a little bit about the stories, about the literature of Milarepa. So we can talk about what I call the corpus or collection of stories of Milarepa, and there are several different texts. The most famous one, translated as The Life of Milarepa, and Milanji described the early English translations and my own translation, and Milanji's own translation into Nepali. This comes from a Tibetan text called The Life of Milarepa, and it was written quite late. It was written in the 15th century, so finished in the year 1488, long after Milarepa had died. And this story, The Life of Milarepa, is a kind of story that is frequently written in Tibet. It's the story of a great saint, of a Buddhist saint. And Tibetans call that kind of a story a namtar. Namtar means liberation, or complete liberation, vimoksha in Sanskrit. And there are hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of biographies of namtars written in Tibetan, one of the most important kind of Tibetan forms of writing. The Life of Milarepa, I think, is maybe the most famous, in part because it is so engaging, it's written so beautifully, it seems so direct and immediate, and we'll talk about why that is. But so The Life of Milarepa is the story of Milarepa's life from his childhood to his early years, to his struggles and performing of difficult trials, to his meditation, his awakening, his teaching disciples through song, through doha, spontaneous songs of realization, and eventually his death. So the story of a saint from birth, awakening to death. And it looks very much like the life of the Buddha. In fact, it was modeled after the life of the Buddha. There's another text, a kind of parallel or a companion text. And that is often translated as the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. And that comes, the 100,000 songs is a Tibetan term, the Gor Boom. So Gor is doha, it's a kind of spiritual song. Boom means 100,000 in Tibetan, but that's not a literal term. There are not actually 100,000 songs. It means all of them collected together. So we might think of this as the collection of all of the songs that Milarepa used to teach his disciples. And it's a very large collection with more than 60 chapters. Every chapter has a story of Milarepa meeting a disciple and the songs that he sings as a kind of teaching. They're very beautiful, it's very extensive, and this is where we find accounts of Milarepa coming to places in Nepal, Kathmandu Valley, to Yomo, Helambu, to Nubri and Sum and other places. All of those are recorded in the 100,000 songs. These are the two most famous. There's also another collection of materials, of stories and of songs that were not included in those previous texts. And they were compiled later, a little bit later. In Tibetan, these are called the miscellaneous stories, the Sung Torbu. And these are things that did not get put in the other collections, but later authors thought they were also important, and they published them about a generation after the first text came out. So it's really the life story and the 100,000 songs that form the collection of Milarepa's teachings. And they're the stories that are so famous in Tibet and the Himalayan world, in Nepal, and now also in the West. So to understand the life of Milarepa, we should say a few words about the historical figure of Milarepa. Many of you, I know, are familiar with the famous life story and his religious life, so I don't want to spend time saying much about that. But I'd like to say a few things about what we know about Milarepa from the perspective of history. And that actually is an easy question to answer because we know very little about Milarepa as a historical person. In fact, we know almost nothing about Milarepa as a historical person. One reason for that is that we have no historical writings from the time that Milarepa lived that describe him as a historical person. And this is very complicated. In some ways, it's very similar to the figure of Shakyamuni Buddha. We have many, many stories about Shakyamuni's life. We have many versions of his life story, his previous lives, the Jatakas, and his final life on earth. And those stories are very meaningful. And yet, from a perspective of history, they don't tell us much about who he was as a historical figure. The same is true about Milarepa. The first recorded writings that we have that may have come from Milarepa himself are at least from a generation later. So maybe even 100 years later. So there's a kind of gap between when he lived and died and when the writings about his life began to appear. I've given you a few slides here just to set the historical context. So the painting here comes actually from a very famous monument. If you've read the life of Milarepa, you know during his training with Marpa, he was forced to undergo a trial, the very difficult trial of building these immense towers. So I was very fortunate to go to the place where Milarepa did this work many times. This is known as Sekar Gutok, or the tower made for Marpa, his guru's son, that is 9 stories tall. So Milarepa's tower still exists. You can see the tower in the center. And it's now surrounded by a giant monastery that was built much later by a famous Tibetan Lama named Pao Tsukla Trengwa. So in that monastery, we have one of the earliest painted portraits of Milarepa, maybe from the 13th century. I think it may be the earliest, certainly the earliest mural painting, so painting on a wall, but maybe one of the earliest paintings ever made of Milarepa. So from the mid-1200s, but still that is at least 200 years after Milarepa died. And I want to point out one feature here I'll come back to later in the talk. You look at how Milarepa is presented here. He's wearing the white robe of a meditator, a repa. Repa is the Tibetan means a robe of white cotton cloth. That was a mark of not of a scholar or a monk, but a meditator. So he's shown as a meditator, cross-legged position, like the Buddha. And yet he's not in the position that we always associate with Milarepa, with his hand to his ear in the gesture of singing. Instead, how is he presented? Well, one hand is in the Bhumisparsha mudra, touching the earth like the Buddha awakening. And the other hand is in the gesture of teaching. Again, teaching like the Buddha. It's a very different imagination of who Milarepa is. Someone who is enlightened and someone who teaches. And this representation, we can say iconography, would change later on. And I'll give an example of that later. So that's Milarepa. Also, we can see that the dates of Milarepa are also very difficult to understand. You see many different kinds of dates. I've written an article about the different, if you're very interested, you can read about that. I'll offer one copy to the library. The dates that I use are the ones here, but just to understand, you see different dates sometimes, and there are reasons why you might use each one of those. So Milarepa is the yogin. He's a great meditator. The second figure in the story is who I often refer to as the madman. And that story, that name comes from the name he used himself. Tsang Heruka. So Heruka is a term I'm sure you're familiar with. Heruka, the wrathful, blood-drinking deity. Tsang Yun is a Tibetan name that means the mad saint, Nyumpa, from Tsang. Tsang is a region of western Tibet. So Tsang Yun was not his given name, but a name he adopted himself and was given to him that demonstrates that he was not an ordinary teacher and not an ordinary meditator, but someone who exhibited a kind of crazy wisdom. He presented himself like the great Siddhas or Mahasiddhas of ancient India who embodied the practice of Vajrayana Buddhism. So Tsangyen Heruka lived many centuries after Milarepa, more than 4 centuries after Milarepa. And yet he was totally inspired by Milarepa's life. Songyun Haruka began as a monk. He trained at many monasteries in central and western Tibet. But eventually, he realized that intellectual studies alone would not lead to liberation. Instead, he must practice meditation like Milarepa. And so he gave up his monastic robes, and he spent many, many years meditating in solitude, in mountain caves and high mountain peaks, in the jungles of a region of Tari on the border of Tibet in India. And he adopted the lifestyle, the unconventional lifestyle of a great Mahasiddha, like the Mahasiddhas of India, like Tilopa and Naropa and other great siddhas that I'm sure you're familiar with. And when he reemerged from his meditation retreat, he had a new kind of mission. Part of that mission was to recreate or to re-inspire the tradition of dedication to meditation that Milarepa represented. He wanted to reestablish the lifestyle of the yogin meditator. Now we have to remember, at the time when Songyun Haruka lived, in the late 1400s, was a time in Tibet when there were giant monasteries. The big monasteries of Lhasa were just being built. They had 10,000 monks, 12,000 monks, 13,000 monks. They were like monastic cities. There were also great lamas. They were recognized reincarnations called tulkus, who were very powerful. They were great spiritual teachers, but also had great political power. And they were great centers of economic power. So massive monasteries, powerful monastic teachers. This was a kind of Buddhism Songyun Haruka disagreed with. He really wanted to reestablish not the big monasteries, but the path of the solitary meditator. And the path of meditation of the yogin was illustrated in the life of Milarepa. And so Songyun Haruka himself went to visit many of the meditation places of Milarepa. He did meditation there. He eventually went to the valley of Kirong, of Mangyol Gungtang, just up from Rasoagati, that leads to the border of Nepal. And while he was there, he had this kind of vision and inspiration while meditating in the place of Milarepa's birth, that I should write a new version of Milarepa's life, in part to inspire people to adopt the life of Milarepa. And moreover, he said that I will write a version of Milarepa's life that is modeled after the life of the Buddha. And so he spent many years writing the text. Of course, he did not only write it, he produced the wood blocks to print them and distribute them. This was very, very expensive, very difficult. It took many, many years. But eventually he did. And the story that Songyun Haruka, the madman, told, the life of Milarepa, the collected songs of Milarepa, became the most famous account of Milarepa in the Himalayan world. In Tibet, you might say it was a bestseller. I think it became the most famous book in Tibet. And of course, it became famous throughout the Himalayan world. It was famous in Bhutan, in India, in Nepal, and now also in the West. Since the 1920s, became famous in the West also. So to understand why the life of Milarepa is so important, in part as a historian, we need to understand the relationship between Milarepa, the yogin, the practitioner, and Songyun Haruka, who is the author of those stories. And so I'll talk a little bit about their relationship later at the end of this talk. Okay. So when we think about the life of Milarepa, we always think about the version that Songyun Haruka himself wrote, this version. And remember, it was written almost 400 years after Milarepa died. So, if you want to understand who Milarepa is as a historical person, this is not a very good guide to that, in part because it was written so many years, many hundreds of years after Milarepa died. It is a very moving account of Milarepa's life. It tells us many profound and important stories and records his teachings. But we need to remember that it was written long after Milarepa died. And instead, what we might do is look for earlier versions of the life of Milarepa. There are many versions of those early stories, but they never became as famous as Songnen Haruka. So let me say a little bit about some of those early versions. There are many accounts of Milarepa's life. The earliest accounts we have that may have been written by Milarepa's own disciples are often very short, sometimes only a few pages. They certainly do not tell the long story with all of the details and record all of the songs. So there are many, many dozens, maybe even hundreds of those short accounts. But what is interesting for us are the larger accounts, the accounts that do tell a long, complicated story of Milarepa's life, and they collect many of those songs. Now, what's interesting, there is one early version. The text itself claims it was written by Milarepa's own disciples, by 12 of his very closest disciples. And this version is called the 12 Great Disciples version, the story written by Milarepa's 12 senior disciples. And if that is true, that is one of our earliest works. And what's interesting is that it looks similar to this account and to the 100,000 songs, but it has many interesting differences. And those differences were then cut out or edited out by Songnen Haruka. So one version of this text we have, this is a manuscript in a museum in the United States. And you can see that it's written in block print Tibetan letters, but also has many illustrations. And interestingly, many early versions of the life of Milarepa have these kinds of illustrations. And I've chosen for you a chapter here you are probably familiar with, and it's Milarepa's meeting with the famous hunter Repa, Kira Gompo Dorje. And Kira Repa himself is said to have been Nishangba from the region of Manang in northwest Nepal. And it's this encounter that Milarepa has first with a deer and a hunting dog, and later the huntsman Kira Repa. And Milarepa teaches to the deer, teaches Dharma to the dog, and then of course teaches Dharma to the fierce huntsman, and converts all of them to Buddhism that became so famous. One of the most famous stories associated with Milarepa. And you can see that story is illustrated here. I don't have a pointer, I'm sorry, but Milarepa is sitting in his cave in Nishang, and the deer, the dog, and Kira Gompo Dorje find Milarepa meditating. Here's the deer, and there's the dog, and here he has taught Dharma to them, and they're sitting by his side, and then Kira Gompo Dorje comes with his arrow ready to shoot, and Milarepa sings a great doha, a great song of realization, and eventually converts. On the next page, you'll see Kira Repa is wearing the white robe. He's been converted to Buddhism, and he's offered up his arrows and bows and his dog and his deer, and followed Milarepa as a great disciple. And we find that in later versions of great collections of the life and songs of Milarepa, and these collections are very interesting. They refer to themselves as a kind of black treasury, And black treasury here has a very specific meaning. The black treasury, or Dzönak in Tibetan, was a temple that was created by a great Tibetan Lama known as the Karmapa, a name many of you may know. And the story here is that the tradition of this version, perhaps written by Milarepa's own disciple, was transmitted to the line of Karmapas very early on as a kind of secret transmission. In Tibetan, they call Nyengyut, or Garna Tantra, the ear-whispered Tantra, meaning that it was secret and could only be taught to one disciple, from one teacher to one disciple in a given generation. And in fact, we find some of these life stories connected with collections of tantric teachings as a kind of introduction to the masters of that tradition. So some of the texts in that lineage, the Black Treasury lineage, tell similar stories, but also with alternate accounts. So here's another example, also illustrated, and it's that same chapter, the huntsman and the deer of Kiro Gumpo Dorje, and we see Milarepa and the deer and the hunting dog, and there's Kiro Gumpo Dorje with his bow and arrow about to offer them up out of his devotion. Now, what's really interesting in these early versions, we find stories that don't appear anywhere else in the famous collection. For example, in an alternate story in this collection, it tells basically the same version. Milarepa meets the deer and teaches Dharma. He meets the hunting dog and teaches him Dharma. He meets the fierce hunter and teaches him Dharma, and they all become converted to Buddhism, and they all follow Milarepa as his guru. In this alternate version, there's another character who appears, and that is Kiro Gumpo Dorje's wife. And she appears also as this very fierce woman. And her husband has just given up. He's offered his bow and arrow to Milarepa out of devotion. And his wife appears furious that her husband will no longer bring home the game of a deer that will feed their family. And she says, "How could you do this? How could I sent you out hunting? How could you give up not only your bow and arrow, but give up your hunting dog and the deer that will feed our family for weeks to come?" And she says, "I not only will kill this so-called yogi, I will cut your head off too." And of course, Milarepa sees this, and he sings her a doha, a song of realization, and she also then becomes converted to Buddhism and becomes her disciple. And the story tells us she goes on to become like a great arhat. She becomes enlightened herself. So here's an interesting example of a female disciple who herself becomes a devotee of Milarepa. She's also Nishangba, so Nepali. She comes from Nepal. And she goes on to become a great enlightened master herself. Now, for some reason, that story was cut and not included in the famous collection that Songyun Haruka published. And it's one reason why it's important for us to go back to the early sources, because we may find accounts that we wouldn't know otherwise. So one thing that Songyun Haruka did that changed the way the life of Milarepa developed was that he not only wrote the life story, but he printed the life story. So this was in the late 1400s, and in Tibet, printing existed, but it was still very new technology. Printing was very time-consuming. So I should say that printing had been around for a long, long time. The first printing, in fact, in the world took place in the context of Buddhism in Korea, with the printing on wood blocks of certain amulets, and then of the Diamond Sutra was also printed in East Asia. Printing existed in China even before the turn of the first millennium. So 8th, 9th century, there was printing in China. They even had movable type printing long before Gutenberg developed movable type in Europe. But in Tibet, in central Tibet, printing came quite late. And it was very expensive. In order to print a book, you needed to cut the trees. You needed carpenters to cut trees, and from the trees to make rectangular blocks. You needed a scribe to write the text on paper. You would take the paper and paste it on the wood. You needed carvers to carve the wood. You needed paper makers to make the paper. Paper came from China and also came from Nepal. You needed ink makers to make the ink. Then you needed the printers to take the paper and the ink, and then you could print one side and the other side, and that was one page, and then you printed all of the pages. It was very, very expensive, and it took a long time. And Songyun Haruka worked very hard to get patronage from local kings and local Buddhist leaders in order to finish this project. But his innovation was that he made woodblock prints of the life story and the 100,000 songs. And what did this let him do? Well, it let him circulate, to make offerings of his story to many places, all of his patrons throughout Tibet and down into the Himalayan world received copies of his life story. So suddenly, everyone had a version of Milarepa's story. And which version? It was this version, what would become the most famous version. So we can thank, in part, the technology of printing for this story to become so famous. Songyun Haruka also created new rituals about the life of Milarepa. In part, he created a kind of guru yoga in honor of Milarepa. And he also commissioned the painting of tankas, of religious paintings that demonstrated the life of Milarepa. And he would send these very carefully, very strategically to all of the monastic leaders and all of the patrons of Buddhism. So suddenly, where there were once many versions of Milarepa's story, now there was one version that had become most famous, and that was Songyun Haruka's version. So we no longer have extant a copy of Songyun Haruka's original woodblock print. Maybe it exists somewhere, but we don't have an example of it. What we do have is the earliest example. So Songyun Haruka himself, he printed, and then in the few decades after, there were many, many new woodblock prints that were made. So one version, just a few decades later, was printed also close to the border of Nepal in a famous meditation place called Uselpuk in 1538. And this is one example of one of the first pages of Milarepa. And it has illustrations of Milarepa, like many Tibetan woodblock prints do. The first pages have illustrations. So I want us to look here at the illustration of Milarepa and see if it looks familiar. Remember I showed you that early mural painting of Mila? So here we have a woodblock print of Mila, and it's kind of similar. There are some differences, but you can see the main thing is that his hand is in the gesture of teaching, in the Dharmachakra mudra. So he's presented as a teacher. What you don't see is this famous gesture of him as a singer. And yet, if we look just a few years later at another woodblock print that was made at another famous hermitage associated with the life of Milarepa, Trakartaso, a place that I'm doing research on now, we see a change. And here, maybe for the first time, we see a circulated, printed image of Milarepa with the iconography that would become standard, by which he would forever become known. with his hand to his ear in the gesture of singing. It's the gesture by which a singer can listen to her or his own voice. In the classical Hindustani tradition, you can hear your own voice by pressing your ear. There are other explanations for why this gesture is used, but it's very unusual, really only associated with Milarepa and with figures who present themselves as reincarnations of Milarepa. So that is to say that the iconography of Milarepa also changed around the time of Tsongyen Haruka. And my theory is that really it was from Tsongyen Haruka that this new iconography appeared. Okay, another interesting example of how to think about the history of Milarepa and how it develops. Let me give one more example of a text before I turn to the last part of my talk in reading the life story of Milarepa. There's a very famous collection of Doha associated with the lineage of Milarepa, and that is called the Ocean of Kagyu Songs, the Kagyu Gurtso. And this was compiled by another master in the lineage of Karmapas, the 8th Karmapa, Mikyo Dorje. Oh, sorry, it's not Mike Dorje. That was an autocorrect mistake. Sorry for that. In the 1500s. And this, as the name suggests, is a collection of Doha of Gur, or of songs, of spiritual songs, associated with Milarepa and all of the masters of his lineage. And Milarepa is prominent in that collection too. And I want to show you an example of a very beautiful manuscript that I came upon, not from Tibet or even Nepal, but from Bhutan. And it's another example of how the tradition of Milarepa now lives as a kind of active and practiced tradition, how the tradition that Tsongyen Haruka created now lives on in practiced tradition. So this is a unique collection of songs that's maintained. It's held in a small temple monastery in central Bhutan, near Tongsa, Bhutan. And it has a combination of different elements that is really unique. So here you see that's a recording of different songs of Milarepa. And then there are these beautiful illustrations that evoke the scene in which Milarepa may have sung his composition. And here you see Milarepa is singing to his master, to his guru Marpa. But also you see a notation in Tibetan called yang yik, a kind of chanting notation. This is quite unusual for Doha texts, and it describes the kind of melody, the approach of chanting that the reciter should adopt. And so it's a sort of combination of practices of reading the story, of evoking mentally the environment in which that song took place, but also the particular melody in which one should sing. So quite beautiful. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the background, the history, the figures of Milarepa, and the author and editor of these texts, Tsongyen Haruka. I've talked a little bit about the historical development of those texts. I want to end by reading a very short passage from the life of Milarepa to illustrate how we might think about the story in new ways. And this adopts a perspective of a kind of literary studies, but also of Buddhist studies. So taking a kind of deep reading, a very close reading of the story. And in fact, it's the very first sentence of this story. So if you look at the famous translation by the Tibetan translator into English, Lobsang Phalungpa, he was a great pioneer of translation. He produced a beautiful version in English. But I always thought it was amazing. He left out and did not translate the very first sentence of the text, which in some ways is the most important. And this is that sentence. It's very short, and you all will recognize it. And that sentence is, "Thus did I hear at one time." Thus did I hear at one time. So here's that passage for you, and I'll read it, just so we all have it in mind. "Thus have I heard," I translated in a slightly different way. This is my translation. "Thus have I heard, at one time, the powerful Lord of Yogins, the great Heruka himself, greatly renowned as Jetsun Milarepa, was residing in the sacred place called Belly Cave, that's Trupapup, close to Nyelam, on the border with Nepal, in the region of Nyenam, turning the wheel of the great vehicle Mahayana Dharma, seated in the midst of his heart disciple yogins," and then there's a list of all of his disciples who are seated there. So here's the first sentence. "Thus have I heard." This sounds familiar to you, I assume. Yeah? Where do you find that sentence proclaimed? Where have you heard that before? Evam Maya Shrutam. And there we go. So it is the sentence that begins every Buddhist sutta and sutra. The most important phrase in Buddhist literature. In Tibetan, Dike Daki Tupa Duchikna Evam Maya Shrutam. And for commentators of Buddhist literature, this is referred to as the Ubodhgata, or in Tibetan, the Lenglong. We might call it the scriptural opening. It sets the context for what follows, in part by authorizing it, by presenting it and proving what follows as authoritative Buddhist scripture. So in Buddhist literature, we refer to that as Buddha Vachana, right? Buddha voice, the speech of the Buddha, the authentic speech of the Buddha. And for a scripture, for a sutra to be authentic, it must be considered Buddha Vachana, to be voiced by the Buddha. And of course, I know that many of you know this. This is very complex. It often means that it was literally spoken by the Buddha himself, but it can also be inspired speech. It can be spoken through the inspiration of the Buddha. But it must be considered Buddha Vachana, and that is marked by the statement, Evam Maya Shrutam, or thus have I heard. And I'll come back to this. So if we look at the next part of this text, at one time, the Lord of Yogins, the great Heruka himself, and so forth. This also comprises a very specific element of Buddhist scripture. This is the scriptural setting, or the Lengshi. And what it does is it presents the context, the historical context in which the Buddha gave his sermon. So that it didn't just happen out of nowhere. It happened at a certain place in a certain time. And so we might read in some Buddhist sutras, at one time the Buddha was residing in Great Vulture Peak, and at that time he was surrounded by a gathering, by a sangha of bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, and so on and so forth. And we find that exactly mirrored in the opening of Tsongyon Heruka's Life of Milarepa. This is something totally unique. No other author of Milarepa's life story made this claim, presented this kind of language. So the text begins, "Thus have I heard." And we know this is a statement of authority, of Buddha Vachana. It proves that what follows is an authoritative Buddhist scripture. But what's interesting for us here in the life of Milarepa is to understand, who is I in this context? Now, this is a really important context question in the context of of the interpretation of Buddhist scripture. And Buddhist commentators spend a lot of time understanding how we make sense of this phrase, "Thus have I heard." Who is the I in "Thus have I heard"? Well, in general, we might think of that individual as the rapporteur. That's the English word. In Tibetan, is referred to as the gatherer of the Buddha's word, the Ga Dupapo, the one who collects or gathers what the Buddha has taught. It's the individual who has directly heard and brought together, remembered, and then brought together what the Buddha actually taught. And as we know, for most Buddhist scriptures, for most Buddhist Mahayana scriptures, that figure is Ananda himself. Ananda was the great disciple of the Buddha, said to have been present at every sermon the Buddha gave. And during the first Buddhist council, he stood before the Sangha and he recited the words of the Buddha from his perfect memory. And so, thus have I heard presents Ananda's own perfect experience, perfect memory of what the Buddha actually taught. But in the context of the life of Milarepa, of course, we know it cannot be Ananda. This is a story that takes place in Tibet. Of course, Ananda wasn't present. So who is the I in Thus Have I Heard? Well, in the early English literature, early scholars of the life of Milarepa had a theory that it was actually Rechungpa. That is, Milarepa's disciple Rechungpa. Why? Because in the beginning of the story, if you read the life of Milarepa, Rechungpa requests Milarepa to tell his story. But that's not really fitting because Rechungpa is not associated with the writing of this story at all. So my particular reading of this introductory statement is that the I here is the author himself, Songyun Haruka. Our author, in the late 1400s, the great Mahasiddha who developed and promoted Milarepa's tradition, was putting himself as an authoritative figure in recording and telling the life of Milarepa. And I can say just a few more words about why that might be the case. Songyun Haruka spent his life cultivating the style of yogic meditation practice that Milarepa practiced. He spent his life traveling and documenting all of the places associated with Milarepa. He spent his life building up the tradition of the yogi meditator. But he also had a very special relationship, we might say, with Milarepa. So if you read the biography of Songyun Haruka himself, he talks about how in his early years, while in deep meditation retreat, he had a vision in which Milarepa appears and narrates his life story. So in a sense, Songyun Haruka did hear the life of Milarepa directly from his subject of his biography, directly from Milarepa himself. So that's one way in which there's a direct connection. But there actually is one more connection that is even closer. There's one time when a disciple of Songyun Haruka says to him, "You are such a great teacher. You must be a reincarnation of a great master. Can you please tell us whose reincarnation you are?" And Songyun Haruka was kind of a trickster and a jokester, and he didn't want to answer directly. And so instead he says, well, if you go to the retreat place in which I stayed of Lapchi, sure the place you know, on the border between Nepal and Tibet, famous place of Milarepa, if you go to the meditation caves of Lapchi and look at the footprints there, you'll know whose incarnation I am. And of course, those footprints are Milarepa's. But at the end of Songyun Haruka's life, just before he passes away, he gathers all of his disciples together. And in his final pronouncement, he says to his disciples, you should consider, don't grieve, don't be upset, don't fear that you are losing your teacher. You should be happy and grateful that you have had the chance to study the true and perfect Dharma. And moreover, that you have received the Dharma from Milarepa himself. So very clearly, Songyun Haruka considered himself to be an embodiment, a manifestation of Milarepa. And we know that the Tibetan tradition later echoed that. There are later Tibetan writers who regard Sonyan Heruka as a reincarnation of Milarepa. So again, thus have I heard, it is in a sense Sonyan Heruka telling the life of Milarepa, and that story is also his own story. And this is where I want to end, going back to the idea of biography of Namtar. So the life of Milarepa is often considered, is titled a biography. It is a Namtar, that's in the title, that is given to it in Tibetan. And yet, if you read carefully, we know that the story is presented as Milarepa telling his own story. Milarepa narrates the accounts of his life. And in that sense, the story is not a biography, but instead an autobiography. Milarepa is telling his own life. And in Tibetan, that is a rangi namtar, telling one's own life story. So it's an autobiography, Milarepa telling his own story, but we know in fact that it's a biography because it was written by the madman 400 years after Milarepa died. And yet, if you read carefully and you understand the historical context of the author and the subject of that story, we come to understand again that it actually is a kind of autobiography. Sonyan Heruka is telling the life of Milarepa, but that life is also his own life. And it presents a kind of authority to his version of the life of Milarepa. And I think this is one reason why the generations of people who came to read the life of Milarepa after Sonyan Heruka came to understand this version as so important, as so powerful, as so deeply embodying the life of Milarepa. And honestly, I think it's one of the reasons why I became so fascinated with this story and have spent so many years now trying to understand it myself. So I think I should stop. I've talked for a very long time. So thank you for your attention, and I would love to hear any questions you might have.